Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire, bringing you part 2 of history in games, or at least, history in our tabletop role-playing games and the like. And last time I had talked about, how the different species, how they live for different lengths of time, how that affects their perception of history. As you take humans, for example, who, like I said, probably average, around 60, 70 years in a medieval fantasy game. For them, after an event has occurred, 300 years go by, that's no longer personal memory. We've gone past that. It's something that's going to be more cultural, local, a town or city's history, or a part of a national history. It's going to be part of a cultural identity. Whereas if you take a dwarf who can easily live, 4, 5, 600 years possibly, that may well be a personal memory for them. That's not going to just be some distant thing. It might be old information for them, but it's something that has occurred within their lifetime, and thus is not going to seem quite so foreign and distant to them like it would for a human being. And same thing for an elf, especially for an elf, where, a century can blink by in a minute. I mean, depending on the game you're playing, most Dungeons and Dragons games typically assume elves live around about 1,000 years or so, 1,100. But there's still some other games like Rollmaster where elves have the option of being immortal, functionally living for far, far longer. 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. And, Elrond from Lord of the Rings is a pretty standard case of this. Elrond and several other elves from the Lord of the Rings series. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility for an elf to have borne witness to some event from, 10,000 years ago. That's going to be something etched into their memory. Assuming it's not forgotten amidst a lot of other information, depending on how you run memory for these different creatures. But, again, that goes on to influence how they look at history, and thus it influences how their culture is shaped and formed. Over 140 years, let's say, you could potentially see 3 to 4 generations of human beings, the oldest dying off, the next generation hitting that old age where they're not far off from passing from this life, then the third generation, which is coming into its own and beginning to generate the fourth generation, which, are going to largely be a bunch of children, potentially, So, you have 4 generations of people right there. Whereas for, again, dwarves and elves, you're looking at a single generation, if that. And that kind of ties into how much more slowly the other cultures can move. Because, if you have potentially 4 different generations within a 140-year time span for human beings, that's a lot of wiggle room for them to start changing and innovating. And why to the other species they feel like that these human beings, they just keep diving into all these new things. They're moving way too fast. Why? It's frustrating. But that's part of what makes humans adaptable and resilient. They're able to adjust to new situations faster, and are willing to adopt new ideas much faster. I mean, take a look at how we feel like some of our elders are so stubborn now. Imagine how much more stubborn a person can get when they can live for 500 years, how much more set in their ways they become, and how much harder it is to shake off those traditions when, a tradition might be 2,000 years old, but that's only 4 generations for dwarves and potentially only 2 for elves, if that. So their traditions become much more culturally ingrained just because their culture is going to advance and move much more slowly compared to a human's culture. Not to say that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. They have a much more direct connection with their history, and the fact that they can take so much more, they live so much longer, means they can take much more time with things. And take the dwarves' reputation for stubbornness. They make their homes in the hearts of mountains. And I'm now joined by my most adorable co-host, Nora, journeyman storyteller and initiate to now the 8th circle of lore. Yeah? She's over here dancing and being just absolutely adorable. Come over and say hi, Nora. But they carve their homes into the hearts of mountains. They work the stone, they harvest the minerals and ores, gemstones. They produce all of these materials out of there because they're long-lived, stubborn, and hardy folk. And so that's reflected in their culture, the fact that their homes and buildings are made out of impeccable masonry and stonework, partly because they can afford to take their time to do it right. Well, or at least that's what I imagine a dwarf would say for most of your standard fantasy settings. If it's worth doing right, and so you're going to take your time and get it right. And if you screw up, well, you know what? You're going to start over and do it all again. And so, because they can live so long, it produces incredible artisanry and craftsmanship, especially since that's what they revolve their lives around, living and working inside of a mountain. I mean, think about how unyielding and almost eternal a lot of mountains seem. I mean, I live next to the Rocky Mountains in western Montana, and these mountains are just huge, soaring, towering things that have been here long before I walked this earth and will be here long afterwards. So, and take that idea, take that image of just this unyielding, unbowing mountain, and dwarves live inside of it, and they bend it to their will. Through hammer, chisel, and pick, they work their way through everything, setting up and carving their way into and throughout a mountain, with mines tunneling deep, deep within the earth, touching onto the Underdark in some cases. The massive caverns where you find drow elves, Duergar, and all kinds of other creatures that call the sunlight something foreign. And now then we think about the elves, how long-lived they are, just the differences in culture that they have, from the fact that, they typically are depicted, living within the forests, constructing their buildings so that they move and flow with the natural order of things. Their homes and buildings don't overtake or cut down the trees, but instead move with them, incorporate them in the design. And their own constructs just seem impossibly graceful where they're not just intertwined with nature, just impossibly graceful and just flowing with that same dexterous grace that the elves themselves exhibit, that ethereal otherworldliness that just is so encapsulated and defined by their innate being. They can live millennia, so of course they can spend a lot of time dedicating themselves to a single task or single activity. And it wouldn't be unusual to see elves that become master carpenters, masons, metal workers, jewelers, different things like that. And on top of the fact that, you take the fact that a couple of centuries is nothing, they can become adept warriors very quickly. Very quickly. They can master fighting to a level that most human beings can't, just because they get to live for so long, so they get to practice. And not only that, but through their ability to live on through such advanced ages, they can potentially experience more conflict than any human being will ever hope to see. And thus they can become very powerful warriors very quickly. But the longer lived something is, typically the slower that they reproduce. So elves, they don't reach the maturity till, they're 125 some odd years old. So that's going to take time. Just that alone will take them time to popping out more kids, so they're culturally, they will shift more slowly just based off of that as well. And it all comes around and ties together with just how they approach things. Dwarves will take a long time doing things. Elves will take even longer. And also dwarves tend to find elves to be fairly flighty, and smart-ass know-it-alls, but then again, an elf probably does know it all, or at least has had the lifetime of experience to tell them, yeah, I've seen this before. This is nothing new to me. And the dwarf might grumble about it, and the humans will be like, what the hell are you even talking about? We need you to act now. It's like, no, we need this. This bears out some careful consideration. We need to think things through a bit more. We can't just be hasty like you are. We have to be careful with things. We need to take our time and approach things because they can take their time. It would take an especially dire threat to get them to move incredibly fast. It would have to be a direct threat towards them. What a human might recognize as a very immediate and dire threat, an elf might go, I've seen a lot of things like this before and we've managed to pull through, so you need to calm down. But that could be an arrogant misreading of the situation. It's based off of their experience, but I could start talking myself in circles here. In either case, these things will go on to help shape their culture and their outlook, and of course their politics. All of the culture and history, kind of the same thing. A cultural history that all ties into and informs politics. Those experiences shape a person's viewpoint, and the fact that somebody who can live up to 500 years might have experienced something that directly or even indirectly, that will still shape their viewpoint and experience, whereas a human only relies on word of mouth, oral traditions, history, whatever records are in place there, and then interpretation of those records, and then cultural memory. Their identity can be tied up in something that's full of half-truths, whether intentional or not. And so that can bring these different cultures into conflict, but at the same time, it can still be a shared thing that ties them together. There's a saying I'd read in one of these books that a dwarf doesn't really get to know a human being until they've spent enough time around them to know their grandchildren. So 3 generations there, and finally the dwarf will make friends with the human, with the human family. And so then they have that tightness and that closeness there where they're bonded together, and that can be a shared memory right there, because that particular family and whatever other people they live with, they have a tie, a living tie to more distant history for them. You know, a great-great-grandchild of some hero can have a friend of their family who can tell them all about their ancestor and in fairly accurate detail. And gosh, what a rich and awesome thing that would be. I mean, what would it be like to be able to talk to somebody like Otto von Bismarck today, or Mansa Musa, or shoot, a Crazy Horse, any number of other historical figures, having that direct tie to that history? That would be just unfathomably awesome and radically change a lot of what we know and how we conceptualize history. So that interaction right there between 2 separate species, 2 separate cultures, can radically alter things depending on the interaction. But it all depends on how you want to utilize this and incorporate it. Every NPC, in theory, has their own history and their own backstory. Obviously, we have such a limited time that we cannot write down the details of every single last person, however much we might try sometimes, but it's there, and you should be ready and willing to seize upon the moment, especially if players seem interested in digging into a particular thing. Of course, you know, that's where you lay out different myths, legends, stories, and histories, the things that you want the players to glom onto. I mean, if they want to investigate whether or not this distant hero from in their bloodline really did all the things they had done, they might seek out some of their former companions who might be a dwarf, a half-elf, an elf, or some other long-lived race. They might seek them out and then go on this investigation, this journey, gathering all these records and details to try to find their secret hidden tomb, retrieve their shield, their armor, their weapon, whatever it might have been, retrieving these historical artifacts that might be powerful magic items in their own right, and go and prevent some other great catastrophic evil from happening. It's a very classic story, and it's basically a trope, but it's a good trope, especially when you do it right. So thinking about and laying out these histories and how the different races or species, whatever you want to call it, laying it out ahead of time can be intensely, richly rewarding. I mean, gosh, can you tell I'm a history nerd? I love all of these things. But again, I could probably start talking a little bit too much, but that's why I've been talking about history and politics. These things all tie and loop together and can be used to thoroughly enhance your games. Just give them a little bit of thought, a little bit of conceptualization, because past wrongs can be a motivator for your villains. They can be villains who might have relatable, understandable backstories and histories that the players might go, yeah, I can see why you're pissed. But that was 800 years ago, has very little to do with me beyond the fact that I'm descended from that person, so you're being kind of a dick here. We're going to put a stop to you, and so on and so forth like that. Oh, gosh, I didn't even touch on truly immortal beings like demons, devils, angels, archons, all those different creatures. Those have very long memories, especially when it comes to defeats. I mean, a spiteful devil coming back to harm a player character for something a distant ancestor had done 2,000 years ago. Utterly bewildering for the character, and be like, oh my god, really? Crap! Why do I have a horned devil coming after me? This is awful, terrible. I don't care what my ancestor did to you, but the devil won't forget, because a defeat is a massive slight and could have potentially seen them demoted down in the nine hells. And demotion is something that they fear even more than just absolute oblivion. But we can touch on all of that another time. With that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. If you enjoyed today's video, go on down there to the comments. Let me know down below. Hello. Say hello.
Hello.
Silly girl. Let me know in the comments down below. And hit the like button. Or if you hated it, hit the dislike button.
Squishy.
Yes, the ear is squishy. Hit the dislike button and still let me know. Or if you're looking for more content from the Gamers Den, well, Circle. Good job. There are 2 more videos popping up over this way. But if this hasn't been your first stop and you've been enjoying content so far, well, you're clearly liking it, so why not go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member. Join the rest of the alumni here at the Gamers Den. But with that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire, and I was joined today by my most adorable co-host, Nora, journeyman storyteller and newly initiated into the 8th circle of lore and currently playing with the new equipment. Thank you all so much for your time, and you all have yourselves a great day.